Okay. Well, good evening, and thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to welcome Andres Martinez Fernandez, Senior Policy Analyst for Latin America at the Heritage Foundation. Andres brings a policy perspective that bridges economic development, transnational organized crime, and the role of extra-regional actors, issues that are central to the themes that we are exploring today. This conversation is very much in the spirit of Contra, an effort to engage across perspectives, to bring academic and policy analysis into dialogue, and to do so in a way that is rigorous, nonpartisan, and open to debate. Andres, thank you very much for joining us. And it has been a pleasure. I know that you very recently came from Miami, the Miami Security Forum that was organized, and that you joined, you were joined by 300 people, and a number of politicians, members of think tanks, and very, very relevant actors that were, that gathered in Miami because you kind of convened and organized that event. Today, we have been talking about an issue from the U.S. perspective. And we are talking about cartel from the U.S. perspectives, and during the whole discussion, it was like, Mexico has done that, the Tren de Aragua, from the United States, point of view, what cartels are, defining these issues as a national security strategy, but from the U.S. perspective. But Talina said something important. It's America first, but not alone. And I would like to ask you, first of all, this new approach to deal with what is called cartels, that I'm still not very sure what you all are talking about, or what it's being framed by those that measure, for example, the number of people that recruited by the cartels, or the labor force for the cartel that supposedly, gather like a third almost of the Mexican labor force, which is for me very exaggerated at some point, because I have not seen, I don't think there's a correct conceptualization of this. But what are the main conclusions from the Miami Security Forum that you organized? What are the main points that you took from the countries of the Americas, the shield of the Americas, the counter-cartel strategy of the United States government? How did you see it from the partners of the United States and the adversaries of the United States within the Americas? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for the invitation. So what we were hosting in Miami this past week was the Miami Security Forum, our inaugural security forum, focused explicitly on the Western Hemisphere and all the security challenges that we're facing within our hemisphere, building alignments with partners from across the Americas, and very much building on some of the initiatives that the Trump administration for months has been building, but particularly we saw on display with the Shield of the Americas gathering and the counter-cartel efforts. So what we were doing there was, again, bringing together particularly an expanded grouping, not just as far as country levels, but really as far as within governments across the region. We had numerous elected officials. We had about just over a couple dozen elected officials from Chile, Honduras, Colombia, several other countries, leading senators and congressmen. We had ministers of defense, ministers of the interior and others, and also we had within the U.S. Elected officials, governors, and administration officials, again, to build out this alignment on what's the best way forward to confront what is universally recognized to be a dire security threat in our hemisphere, whether it's the narco-terrorist organizations, whether it's mass migration and other threats, and something a little bit less That's a little bit less of a consensus within our hemisphere, but certainly within the United States is a consensus, the presence of China within our hemisphere and some of the malign activities that they're engaged in. So what we're doing by bringing this group together is trying to, again, build out that alignment, hearing the different concerns and different needs as well as far as regional countries to be more effective in countering these transnational narco-terrorist groups, because that, just there we have a really substantial part of the challenges is a lack of sufficient resources within, which we heard about from countries, not just at the federal level, but at the local level in different parts of the region, within Mexico, within Brazil as well, and certainly in countries like Ecuador and Colombia, where these groups have become so powerful, so well equipped, so large as far as their own membership and presence, that they have fought to a stalemate, or worse in a lot of cases, the regional security forces that are meant to combat them. So trying to identify what are some of those kinds of bottlenecks and challenges that regional governments are facing in actually implementing a view and a vision of securing our hemisphere against these threats. I would say that view is generally, I kind of glossed over it, but that is a view as far as the need to confront these threats head on. That is increasingly the consensus, I think, throughout the hemisphere. There's certainly within the recent history, there have been governments that have taken very different approaches to these threats, but particularly as we see the recent wave of elections, but also I think just as countries have been living through increasingly volatile and violent periods where these groups have grown and expanded without really having any check on that growth, has left an increasing amount of countries, leaders, and experts across the region with the conclusion that a more aggressive approach is not only warranted but necessary.
So, do you see? So, it seems that there is a sort of consensus in the Americas with regards to this approach. That's what, this is your sense. Or do you see a risk that different countries in the region would interpret these threats in a different way, and this could complicate the coordination? Or do you see more coordination? And where are the risks that you see regionally speaking?
Yeah, well, I should clarify. Certainly there are countries that are not, and governments that are not fully aligned with this vision, and that was kind of on display with just the countries that were invited to participate in the recent forums in Miami that the government held, including the government of Mexico and government of Brazil. There certainly there are continued problems with alignment on the best path forward there. Even there, though, I would note that those governments, I think, are shifting. Certainly compared to the reality or to their posture or a posture of similar governments, just 5 years ago. So that's that is, but there is still some differences of opinion there. As far as what are the kind of risks of more proactive U.S. engagement, and even I assume, probably referencing some of what we've done in the Caribbean and the operation against Nicolas Maduro. Really, I don't think that there is a substantial risk to the to kind of U.S. regional relations of these kinds of operations. Again, because we have seen not only through elections bringing new leadership to the region, but also through the public opinion and the shifting realities of people on the ground dealing with, for example, the consequences of the arrival of these groups like Tren de Aragua into their country, the spread of violence by different groups across the Americas, All these things are really bringing to a new height the consequences of these threats for the people across the Western Hemisphere. And within that context, there seems to be certainly from what I've seen, and I think it's a testimony to it is also the amount of buy-in and engagement you've seen from the administration in these kinds of conferences in Miami, that countries and governments and people across the Americas are ready for a more proactive U.S. role in securing our hemisphere.
Okay, and you, I mean, at the Heritage Foundation, you've done important work on the role of extra-regional actors. How do actors like China, Russia, or Iran intersect with organized crime dynamics in Latin America?
There are numerous ways in which we see this interaction between these extra-hemispheric malign actors and transnational criminal actors within our hemisphere. You see, for example, direct engagement in some cases with the Russian entities, for example, with illicit networks of money laundering, narco trafficking, human trafficking. You also see the use of influence through illicit means within Latin America for certain groups to gain revenue, for example. So the presence of Hezbollah and similar groups in South America and elsewhere, particularly tied into counterfeiting and narco trafficking rings, has been an important lifeline for that organization and others. We've beyond that also seen this is less of a certainly with China. I think probably the most concerning is the direct role that Chinese entities and the Chinese business networks around the pharmaceutical and chemical industry in China have had with fueling the fentanyl crisis in the United States. It's a fundamental element of the fentanyl illicit supply chains to the United States, that you have these precursor chemicals which have basically been flowing freely into Mexico and then used to refine the illicit fentanyl and opioids. So along just about all of the most concern, and then there's weapons trafficking and other elements. But when you look at just about any aspect of these narco-terrorist, transnational criminal networks, you're going to find eventually hostile, extra-hemispheric foreign actors engaged in one way or another. And I think that is a testament to how dire and dangerous these networks and their continued existence is for our hemisphere.
Right. Earlier during the conversation, there was kind of like a comment that I took very seriously with regards to the fact that some of these countries, and we were talking about Brazil and Mexico, two states that are not in alignment with the current national security strategy of the United States, were not invited to one of the major, recent gatherings of the Americas, right? And I think that probably is a risk, is a big challenge for the continuation of this the shield, right? In why you seem very confident about the future. Do you think that then the risks are not that important, or that you're that the United States in the correct way, and the fact that this is seen as a national security problem, and some of the Latin American countries can see this as an imposition, that the majority the consensus is dominating with, contrasting with the opposition, and the possibility that countries that are opposing this strategy can connect with U.S. adversaries? Do you see as a big challenge, or it's not that important?
Well, So one of the, I think an example of what you were talking about is something a previous speaker had talked about where, I think in a tabletop exercise we could see, for example, military action in Mexico by the U.S. maybe resulting in China becoming closer to Mexico. I think those are not that those kinds of dynamics aren't a reality or potential reality, but I think they're probably over-exaggerated as far as the reality of what that would look like and the ultimate impact. The idea of Mexico turning to China and this being a complete shift for their country, their economy, their politics. It's not viable for Mexico in any real way. The Chinese and Mexican economies are pretty similar in that they are manufacturing, low-cost manufacturing, targeting the U.S. and Europe, and there's not a huge market for Mexican goods in China. That's even if there were to be some kind of trade agreement. So I don't think that's a realistic alternative for Mexico. I don't. At the end of the day, I think the Mexican government recognizes that there is a need to have a long-term alignment with the United States. I think the recognition, there's an increasing recognition that the cartel threat is becoming a red line for the United States. Now, to their, in their defense, in the Mexican government's defense, we have had, as recently as just over a year ago, U.S. administrations that have basically turned a blind eye to the fentanyl crisis and the rise of the cartel threats and had little to nothing to say about Mexico's security policies. So there has certainly been mixed messaging in the past coming from the United States towards Mexico, but I think the messaging is very clear now, and in that way, it's my hope and expectation that while we have certainly some challenges in promoting that alignment on how the U.S. and how Mexico can confront these threats, will ultimately align with the reality that these are not groups that either of our people want to be active in our hemisphere or in our countries. And getting towards that end, I think there are numerous challenges, but with a cooperation and clarity as far as what the United States expects, what the Mexican government is looking for, I think that we're already in a much better place than we were, just a couple of years ago, where it was our governments talking past each other, basically.
Okay, I see that. I totally understand. But I will have some other questions, because at Contra, one of our priorities is to integrate data analysis, social network analysis, and machine learning into the study of illicit networks. And we need to conceptualize better what has happened. And also, during the conversations that we had, we talked about the focus on the supply side of this issue. And if we focus on the supply side of this issue, and we do not conceptualize correctly the problem, and we don't address the demand side of this issue, we're going to be failing, because we have failed constantly. During the Merida Initiative time, Mexico and the United States were aligned. Plan Colombia and the United States were aligned, and CARSI, Central American governments, particularly the Northern Triangle, were aligned with the United States strategy, also focus on the supply side of this thing. What do you make of this with regards to the demand side? Because we're really not talking about the demand, and Alan was mentioning, we're just dealing with the supply. But some critics of the current and the past security strategies through law enforcement and now national security strategy, and the cooperation at different levels in the Americas and the inter-American relations. What do you think about the demand side of this issue? How to deal with that? And do you think it's central, or we can deal with the problem just by focusing on the supply side?
No, I do think it is important to attack both sides of this issue, the supply and demand side. And I don't think that you would see or hear people in the administration disagree with that position. I think the problem is that for a very long time, that has been used as kind of a blocking point to say, well, you can't confront the cartels militarily or otherwise until you deal with the demand side, or that the demand side should be where all of the focus should be leveraged. And I mean, that has had, in reality, that has been for particularly the past, with U.S. and Mexico, the past 6+ years, been the dominating policy. We've had the Mexican government pulling back on offensive operations, and under the Biden administration in particular, this was treated as an issue to be addressed both as with root causes kind of development programs and mental health and addiction programs. That is not particularly different from what we saw in the preceding decade either, where, I mean, really since Enrique Peña Nieto, you've seen that pulling back. And on the U.S. side, you've never really had a serious attention to Mexico and the cartels as a security threat. So I think what you're talking about is a dynamic that has reigned for better part of a decade, and produced really disastrous results when you don't also go after the cartel side of this equation. It's something that only continues to grow when you open up these alternatives as the central enforcement mechanism.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Andres. But, well, now the future of policy, right? Looking ahead, do you expect U.S. policy to continue moving toward a more securitized or even militarized framework? How do you see the future of security policy in the Americas, in the Western Hemisphere?
Yeah, I think for the time being, yeah, you will see a more, if you want to call it, militarized approach to security. And that's in part because it's responding to the realities of what these groups are developing as far as their capacities and the nature of the threat that they have. These are organizations that as far as just the overall number of, so for example, in Brazil, PCC, one of the gangs, narco-trafficking gangs in Brazil, has more than twice as many gang members than the entire active duty military of Portugal. You have countries, you have economies in Europe that are dwarfed just by the economic revenue that's generated by Mexican cartels. And you have advanced weapons and resources, international alliances, and globalized networks that these groups have developed over decades. This is not a localized law enforcement threat anymore. The neglect that both the United States and regional governments have given towards these groups has allowed this to grow to a level of really dramatic proportions, and I do think that in most cases that requires a much more aggressive and you could say military-style approach just to contend with the reality of the capacities of these groups.
Thank you very much. Let me just close with a broader question. And if you had to identify one principle that should guide U.S. policy toward transnational criminal organizations over the next decade, what would it be? That's
a great question. I think what be guiding our policy should be one of probably, I would say, a full, and you could say, I don't like the word, but a holistic approach to the security threat environment that we're seeing in Latin America. So that means not just, I don't advocate for, we should just go to like a kingpin policy strategy, and that's, because ultimately I think that's something that is more effective as messaging than it is to the reality of extricating a network. Right. I think there's a need for a more substantial approach that does include going militarily after cartel leadership, going after the underlying support networks, whether it's the infrastructure which is being co-opted by criminal networks, the kind of political influence that these groups have developed in particular parts of countries in the region. And going to your point, going to also the demand side. I think there is a need to address this at all ends in a much more serious way right. Than we have in recent years. I think that the Trump administration is doing a great job in addressing a lot of those sides, certainly much more on the offensive sides. But I think there were some good announcements and efforts made on weapons trafficking recently. An important operation targeting on the U.S. side, weapons traffickers to Mexico. I'd like to see a lot more of that, just as I'd like to see the cartel leadership and criminal organization networks in the region finally face justice and stop posing the really dire threat that they've been posing.
Thank you, Andres. What today's conversation underscores then is now, how we define the problem which shape the tools we use, right, as well. And ultimately the outcomes that we produce, how we define issues and how we conceptualize the problems and, multidimensional strategies for a problem that has multidimensional origins. Our responsibility as scholars and practitioners is to ensure that the definitions and the solutions are grounded in evidence and are open to scrutiny and informed by a diversity of perspectives. In that spirit, we remain committed to rigorous, nonpartisan inquiry and to fostering conversations such as this one. Thank you all very much for being here, and thank you, Andres, for having a conversation with us today. Thank you.